The dawn broke gray and heavy over Peleliu on September 15, 1944. In the pre-landing chaos aboard the transport ships, Marine Private First Class Robert Leckie checked his equipment one final time. He was part of a 60-millimeter mortar section, Weapons Company, 1st Marine Division. What neither he nor the 28,000 other Marines heading toward those beaches could fully comprehend was that they were about to participate in testing a tactical innovation that would fundamentally alter how Japanese defenders experienced combat. The weapon itself was unremarkable. The M2 60-millimeter mortar, a 42-pound tube of steel that had served since 1940, but the technique being perfected in the crucible of the Palau Islands would create a phenomenon so psychologically devastating that captured Japanese soldiers would later describe it in their interrogations not as artillery fire, but as rain that never stopped and the sound of the sky tearing apart. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Puller, chesty to every Marine who served under him, had spent months studying after-action reports from Guadalcanal and Tarawa. The problem was clear. Japanese defenders, dug into elaborate cave systems and reinforced bunkers, could wait out traditional artillery bombardments in relative safety. The solution required rethinking not the weapon itself, but how multiple weapons could be coordinated to create something entirely new. By September of 1944, Marine mortar sections had developed what they called walking fire, a technique where 8 to 12 mortars would fire in carefully timed sequence, creating a continuous cascade of high explosive rounds that gave defenders no respite, no moment to recover, no opportunity to man their positions. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. A well-trained mortar section could maintain a sustained rate of 18 to 20 rounds per minute from a single 60-millimeter tube. The M2's fixed firing pin meant each round detonated the moment it dropped into the barrel. No complex aiming sequence, no elaborate calculations between shots. When 8 mortars coordinated their fire, staggering their timing by mere seconds, they could deliver 160 rounds per minute onto a target area roughly the size of a football field. For the Japanese soldiers huddled in their defensive positions, this meant a new explosion every 0.375 seconds. Not a barrage, not shelling, something closer to a continuous detonation that lasted not for minutes, but for hours. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese Imperial Army had built its defensive doctrine on principles refined through years of combat in China and the early Pacific campaigns. Their soldiers were taught that American bombardments followed predictable patterns. Heavy naval gunfire before landings, artillery preparation before assaults, and brief mortar concentrations to support specific attacks. The key to survival was simple: retreat deep into fortified positions during the bombardment, then emerge to man defensive positions once the shelling lifted. This doctrine had worked at Tarawa, where Japanese defenders had waited out 3 days of naval bombardment, only to inflict horrific casualties when Marines hit the beaches. It had worked at Saipan, where fortress-like positions had held against overwhelming firepower. But the mortar sections landing at Peleliu represented something fundamentally different. The M2 60mm mortar had been developed in the late 1930s based on a French design by Edgar Brandt. Unlike artillery pieces or naval guns that required extensive logistics and fire direction, mortars could be set up anywhere a man could stand. The weapon broke down into 3 components: a lightweight barrel, a base plate, and a bipod mount. 3 Marines could carry a complete system and have it operational within minutes of landing. Each mortar section in a rifle company consisted of a squad leader, a gunner, an assistant gunner, and 3 ammunition bearers, typically carrying 40 to 60 rounds per man in specially designed M2 ammunition vests. The true innovation lay not in the weapon specifications, but in the coordination. Fire direction centers had learned to plot interlocking fire patterns, where multiple mortar sections would receive synchronized fire missions. Section 1 might fire at maximum rate for 30 seconds, then reduce to sustained fire while Section 2 ramped up. Section 3 would maintain harassing fire on alternate coordinates. The result was a moving wall of explosions that could be walked across enemy positions like a steel curtain. Training for this technique had intensified throughout 1944 at Camp Pendleton and Camp Maui, where entire battalions practiced the complex timing required to maintain continuous fire without ammunition exhaustion. The men carrying these weapons into battle understood the weapon's capabilities with an intimacy born of endless repetition. The M2 fired the M49A2 high-explosive round, a 3-pound projectile containing roughly 1/3 of a pound of TNT with a bursting radius of 17 yards. The round's point-detonating fuse meant it exploded on impact, sending razor-sharp fragments in a circular pattern that could kill or wound anyone caught in the open within that 17-yard radius. More importantly for the psychological effect, the high angle of fire meant these rounds plunged almost vertically into target areas, their whistling descent providing only seconds of warning before detonation. Japanese defensive preparations on Peleliu demonstrated their evolution as opponents. Gone were the beach defenses that had been pulverized at Tarawa. Instead, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had ordered construction of more than 500 reinforced positions, caves blasted into coral limestone, concrete pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire, and tunnel systems that allowed defenders to move unseen between positions. Every position was sighted to be invisible to naval gunfire, protected by reverse slopes or thick overhead cover. The Japanese had learned that they couldn't stop American landings, but they could make every yard of advance cost American lives. Their defensive manual emphasized patience. Wait out the bombardment, emerge when it stops, destroy the enemy with disciplined fire. The first Marine assault waves hit Peleliu's beaches at 08:32 on September 15th. Within minutes, the landing had transformed into chaos. The loose coral sand prevented vehicles from moving. Landing craft grounded on unexpected reef formations, and from the ridges overlooking the beaches, Japanese observers waited. They had been ordered to hold fire until the beaches were packed with men and equipment. The Americans, used to immediate opposition, initially interpreted this silence as evidence that the pre-landing bombardment had been effective. Then, at approximately 09:45, the Japanese opened fire. Machine guns, artillery, mortars, and anti-boat guns turned the beach into a killing ground. Marines who had trained for rapid advance inland found themselves pinned in the open, unable to dig foxholes in the coral sand, subjected to fire from positions they couldn't see. The 1st Marines, tasked with pushing inland to secure the left flank, faced particularly intense resistance from a coral ridge system that would come to be known as Bloody Nose Ridge. It was here, in the desperate fighting of that first afternoon, that Marine mortar sections began implementing the techniques they had practiced. Sergeant Elmo Haney, commanding a mortar section in 1st Battalion 1st Marines, established his position roughly 400 yards inland by early afternoon. His 3 mortars, Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, were set up in a rough triangle formation, each tube separated by approximately 30 yards to prevent a single enemy shell from destroying multiple positions. Haney's fire direction came via a field telephone line run by a runner dodging between his position and the battalion command post. The first fire mission came at 1400 hours. Suppress enemy positions, coordinates Victor 479er, continuous fire, ammunition expenditure unlimited. What followed was unprecedented. Haney's section, coordinating with two other sections from the battalion, began what Marines would later describe as the longest fire mission of the Pacific War. For 7 consecutive hours, without pause, 9 60mm mortars delivered high explosive rounds onto Japanese positions along Bloody Nose Ridge. The technique was precise. Each 3-mortar section would fire at maximum rate for 2 minutes, approximately 54 rounds total, then drop to sustained fire for 3 minutes while the next section ramped up. Ammunition bearers formed human supply chains, running boxes of mortar rounds from the beach to the firing positions, each man making dozens of trips under sporadic Japanese fire. The effect on Japanese defenders was catastrophic in ways that went beyond simple casualties. Post-war interrogations and captured diaries revealed the psychological dimensions of this continuous bombardment. Japanese soldiers described entering a state they called shell shock paralysis, unable to leave their caves even when the bombardment paused, convinced that emerging would mean instant death. Unlike artillery fire, which announced itself with the roar of guns and the whistle of shells in flight, mortar rounds gave minimal warning. Their near-silent descent meant the first indication was often the explosion itself, and because the mortars fired at such high angles, the rounds could drop directly into trenches, behind ridges, into the entrances of caves, anywhere a soldier might seek shelter from more traditional fire. A diary recovered from a Japanese sergeant killed on Bloody Nose Ridge contained entries describing the bombardment. September 15th afternoon. The shells do not stop. We cannot leave the cave. Every man who tries is killed before taking 3 steps. We can hear them coming now, a whistle like wind, then an explosion, then another whistle, then another. There is no pattern. We cannot predict them. Some men have gone mad from waiting. The sustained bombardment had tactical effects that rippled through the Japanese defensive scheme. Machine gun positions that had been carefully sighted to enfilade approaching Americans remained unmanned because crews couldn't reach them. Ammunition resupply between positions became impossible. Communication between defending units broke down as runners couldn't move. Most critically, the Japanese doctrine of emerge and fight, when bombardment stopped, proved unusable, because the bombardment never stopped. Marine riflemen advancing behind the mortar curtain observed Japanese soldiers behaving in ways that violated everything they'd learned about their enemy. Defenders who had been trained to fight to the death would surrender after being subjected to just 30 minutes of continuous mortar fire. Positions that should have required flamethrowers and satchel charges to reduce were found abandoned, their defenders having fled deeper into the ridge system. In some cases, Japanese soldiers emerged from caves with hands raised, something virtually unheard of in previous Pacific battles, citing in broken English the rain that never ends as their reason for surrendering. The innovation wasn't limited to the 60mm mortars organic to rifle companies. Heavier 81mm mortars, employed at battalion level, began coordinating with the lighter tubes to create layered bombardments. The M1 81mm mortar could fire a 10-pound high-explosive round to ranges exceeding 3,000 yards. When fire directors coordinated 60mm mortars on near targets with 81mm tubes on deeper positions, they created a zone of continuous detonation that could be hundreds of yards deep. Japanese soldiers attempting to flee bombardment in their immediate area would run directly into the heavier mortar fire, falling on positions farther back. By nightfall on September 15th, Marine mortar sections on Peleliu had fired more than 12,000 rounds, roughly 1,300 rounds per mortar in continuous operation. The logistical achievement was as remarkable as the tactical one. Each 60mm round weighed just under 3 pounds. Delivering 12,000 rounds from beach to firing positions meant moving 18 tons of ammunition across contested terrain, much of it hand-carried by ammunition bearers making repeated trips under fire. The beachmasters who coordinated logistics reported that mortar ammunition expenditure exceeded even machine gun ammunition in the initial assault. The human cost of maintaining this fire was substantial. Mortar crews worked in brutal conditions. Coral dust mixed with propellant residue created a choking haze around firing positions. The temperature inside the mortar tubes climbed to temperatures that could blister skin on contact. Barrel wear became a serious concern. The fixed firing pins on M2 mortars saw such intensive use that battalion armorers had to perform field repairs on damaged firing mechanisms. Several Marines were injured when hot tubes fired prematurely as rounds were being loaded, the heat causing propellant to ignite before the round fully seated in the barrel. But the technique was proving devastatingly effective. On September 16th, when 1st Marines attempted to continue their advance against Bloody Nose Ridge, they employed an evolved version of the walking fire technique. 8 mortar sections, 24 tubes total, created a moving barrage that advanced at 50 yards every 2 minutes. Behind this steel curtain, rifle platoons moved with relative safety, facing disorganized resistance from defenders too shocked or too dead to maintain cohesive defensive fire. What should have been a grinding assault that cost hundreds of casualties instead became a methodical advance that cleared Japanese positions at a fraction of the expected cost in American lives. The Japanese response demonstrated how completely this tactic had disrupted their defensive plans. Colonel Nakagawa issued orders for defenders to abandon forward positions and withdraw to the central ridge system, where cave depth might provide better protection. This retreat, unthinkable in earlier Pacific battles where Japanese doctrine demanded holding every position to the death, marked a fundamental acknowledgement that their defensive tactics had been rendered obsolete. The Waiji continuous mortar fire had created conditions where even the most fanatical defenders couldn't effectively fight. You could survive in your cave, or you could emerge to man your fighting position and die within seconds. There was no longer a third option. Engineers attached to 1st Marines began analyzing Japanese positions overrun in the first 2 days of fighting. What they found was revealing. Many positions showed minimal structural damage from naval gunfire or aerial bombing, but displayed dozens of mortar impact craters in the immediate vicinity. The high-angle fire meant rounds could land on reverse slopes in defilade, anywhere defenders thought themselves safe from flat trajectory fire. One particularly telling position, a machine gun nest protected by 6 feet of coral and concrete overhead, had been abandoned not because the structure was destroyed, but because the approaches to it had been so heavily cratered that the crew couldn't reach it without crossing open ground that was under continuous mortar observation. The psychological dimension of the mortar barrage extended beyond simple fear. Japanese training emphasized discipline, unit cohesion, and willingness to sacrifice for the emperor. But that training assumed combat would occur in discrete engagements, attacks and counterattacks, bombardments and assaults, with breathing room between. The continuous mortar fire created a state of constant crisis where every moment was potentially the moment of death. Captured Japanese soldiers described this as worse than banzai charges, worse than American flamethrowers because those at least ended. The mortars never ended. By September 18th, mortar sections had refined their techniques further. Fire direction centers could now call for priority fire, where every available mortar would concentrate on a single target for maximum shock effect. During one such mission supporting 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines' assault on a heavily defended ridge position, 36 mortars fired simultaneously for 3 minutes, delivering more than 200 rounds onto a target area measuring roughly 75 yards by 100 yards. Marines assaulting the position afterwards reported finding Japanese soldiers in their caves, alive but catatonic, unable or unwilling to respond to commands or threats. The innovation rapidly spread across the Pacific theater. Reports from Peleliu reached commanders preparing for future operations at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Training for mortar sections intensified, with emphasis on coordination and sustained fire techniques. The weight of mortars in the marine logistics chain increased dramatically. If these weapons could produce such results, then ammunition expenditure limits needed to be revised upward. What made the mortar barrages particularly effective was their integration with other supporting fires. Unlike artillery, which required extensive coordination and fire direction from rear areas, mortar fire could be controlled by company-level forward observers who were with the assault troops. If a rifle platoon encountered resistance, mortars could be firing within minutes, often within seconds. The proximity of mortar positions to front lines meant response time was measured in moments, rather than the hours sometimes required for artillery support. And because each rifle company had its own mortar section, this capability was organic, always available, always responsive. The Japanese had their own mortars, notably the Type 89 knee mortar, that could fire 25 rounds per minute with a good crew. But Japanese employment doctrine emphasized harassing fire and opportunistic attacks rather than sustained suppression. Their ammunition supply couldn't support the kind of continuous fire Marine sections were maintaining. More critically, American air superiority meant Japanese ammunition resupply was constantly disrupted, while Marine logistics could land thousands of rounds daily to support their mortar crews. As the battle for Peleliu ground into its second week, the character of combat began to change in response to the mortar tactics. Japanese defenders, unable to hold forward positions under continuous bombardment, withdrew to the deepest caves and strongest positions in the Umabrogo Ridge system. The series of coral ridges that would cost the 1st Marine Division more than a month of brutal fighting to secure. But even here, mortar fire proved crucial. While the heavy overhead cover prevented mortars from directly hitting defenders deep in caves, the continuous fire prevented Japanese forces from moving, from resupplying, from reinforcing threatened positions. Caves that might have held for weeks were reduced in days because their defenders were effectively besieged by mortar fire. The cost in American lives for this tactical innovation was measured not just in combat casualties, but in the physical and mental toll on mortar crews. Maintaining continuous fire for hours, often under counter-battery fire from Japanese artillery, required a level of discipline and endurance that tested even veteran Marines. Crew members suffered hearing damage from the continuous concussion of firing. Hands blistered and bled from handling hot ammunition. The mental strain of repetitive, dangerous work, loading, firing, for hour after hour, led to what was then called combat fatigue, but might today be recognized as acute stress reaction. Yet the technique continued to evolve. By late September, mortar sections had developed what they called box barrages, 4-sided patterns of continuous fire that would trap Japanese soldiers attempting to flee from one position to another. Coordinating with forward observers, mortar crews could seal off sections of the ridge system, then methodically reduce each position while preventing enemy reinforcement or escape. This required precise timing and exceptional fire discipline, but the results justified the effort. Areas that might have taken days to clear with conventional assault tactics fell in hours when subjected to coordinated mortar bombardment. The Americans weren't the only ones learning. Japanese tactical doctrine began to evolve in response to the mortar threat. Orders captured from late September instructed defenders to disperse, to avoid concentrating forces where they would present profitable targets for mortar fire. Small independent units in well-separated positions became the norm. But this defensive adaptation came at a cost to overall Japanese combat effectiveness. Dispersed defenders couldn't mass fires, couldn't support each other, couldn't conduct coordinated counterattacks. The mortar barrages had forced a tactical dilemma: concentrate and be destroyed by mortars, or disperse and lose combat effectiveness. Medical officers treating casualties from both sides noted the physical effects of sustained mortar bombardment. American casualties from Japanese mortar and artillery fire showed the typical pattern of shrapnel wounds, random distribution based on where the individual was when the shell burst. But Japanese casualties recovered from positions subjected to extended American mortar fire showed patterns suggesting many had died not from direct shrapnel but from overpressure effects, the repeated concussive force of explosions in confined spaces like caves causing internal injuries even when shrapnel didn't penetrate. The lessons from Peleliu traveled quickly through the Marine Corps. By late October of 1944, when 1st Marine Division was withdrawn from the island after sustaining more than 6,500 casualties, debriefing officers compiled detailed reports on the mortar tactics that had proven so effective. These reports reached commanders preparing for Operation Detachment, the invasion of Iwo Jima scheduled for February of 1945. What had been innovative at Peleliu would become doctrine at Iwo Jima. The volcanic island of Iwo Jima presented unique challenges for mortar employment. Unlike the coral ridges of Peleliu, Iwo's terrain consisted of loose volcanic ash that absorbed shrapnel and reduced the effective casualty radius of mortar rounds. The Japanese garrison of more than 20,000 men under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent months fortifying the island with a sophistication that exceeded anything Americans had encountered before. Kuribayashi's defensive plan specifically addressed the mortar threat that had devastated his colleagues at Peleliu. His orders to his troops were explicit. Fortifications must have overhead cover sufficient to withstand sustained mortar bombardment. All positions must be connected by tunnels allowing movement without exposure to surface fire. The Japanese general had studied American tactics carefully. He understood that the Americans would land with massive firepower support, that they would employ their mortars in the continuous barrage technique that had worked so well in the Palaus. His response was to build deeper, to connect everything underground, to create a fortress where defenders could wait out even the most sustained bombardment. By February 19, 1945, when the first waves of Marines hit the black sand beaches, Kuribayashi had created a defensive system with 11 miles of tunnels, 1,500 cave positions, and interlocking fields of fire that covered every yard of the island. The Marines landed with more mortars than ever before. The 3 divisions committed to Iwo Jima, 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, brought 216 60mm mortars and 108 81mm mortars ashore in the first waves. Additionally, specialized landing craft designated LCI MEMS, Landing Craft Infantry Mortar. Each mounted 3 4.2-inch chemical mortars. These boats had proven their worth at Peleliu, where 4 vessels had fired 830 rounds in support of pinned-down infantry. At Iwo Jima, 18 LCIMs supported the assault, capable of delivering devastating fire from offshore positions. The battle that began that morning would test the mortar tactics to their absolute limit. Initial resistance seemed light. Marines crossed the beaches and began pushing inland with fewer casualties than expected. Then, at approximately 1000 hours, the Japanese opened fire. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery that had remained silent during the bombardment erupted from positions the Americans couldn't see. The beaches became a slaughter pen. Marines attempting to advance found the volcanic ash made movement almost impossible. Every step sank 6 inches into the loose material. Digging foxholes was futile. The ash simply collapsed back in. And from Mount Suribachi and the high ground to the north, Japanese observers directed withering fire onto the crowded landing areas. Mortar sections attempting to set up on the beaches encountered immediate problems. The loose ash wouldn't support base plates. They simply sank under the recoil of firing. Sergeant John Basilone, a Medal of Honor recipient from Guadalcanal who had specifically requested return to combat duty, was killed by a mortar round while attempting to guide a tank section through the ash. His mortar section, unable to establish stable firing positions on the beach itself, was forced to manhandle their weapons inland to more solid ground while under constant fire. The solution came through desperate improvisation. Mortar crews discovered that by using ammunition boxes, logs from destroyed landing craft, and sheets of metal, they could create makeshift platforms that distributed the base plate weight and prevented sinking. By afternoon of D-Day, mortar sections had established firing positions and began employing the continuous barrage techniques developed at Peleliu. But the Japanese positions, buried under tons of volcanic rock and concrete, proved far more resistant to mortar fire than the coral caves of Peleliu. The first 72 hours of fighting on Iwo Jima saw mortar employment reach unprecedented levels. Fire direction centers coordinated barrages involving 50 or more tubes simultaneously. The 4th Marine Division alone expended more than 40,000 mortar rounds in the first 3 days, an average of more than 13,000 rounds per day, or approximately 240 rounds per tube per day. Ammunition supply became the critical limiting factor. Landing craft that should have been bringing infantry replacements and medical supplies were instead shuttling mortar ammunition from the offshore supply ships. Yet despite this massive expenditure of ammunition, Japanese resistance remained fierce. Kuribayashi's defensive design was proving its worth. When mortars concentrated on a position, defenders would withdraw through tunnels to alternate positions, wait out the bombardment, then return when it lifted. The continuous fire technique that had broken Japanese morale at Peleliu was less effective against defenders who could move underground without exposure to fire. The Marines were learning a painful lesson. Even the most devastating tactic could be countered by sufficiently determined and well-prepared defenders. The innovation came from studying Japanese tactics. Forward observers noted that while defenders could hide from mortar fire, they had to emerge to actually fight. The solution was to coordinate mortar fire not for destruction, but for denial, using continuous fire to prevent Japanese soldiers from manning their fighting positions. This required a different technique. Rather than massing fires for maximum shock effect, mortars would maintain sustained harassing fire on known or suspected positions, not enough to destroy the fortification, but enough to make approaching it suicidal. Corporal Albert Mikkel, a mortar section leader with the 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, described the evolution of tactics in his later memoir. We learned that killing Japs in their caves was near impossible with what we had, but we could make sure they couldn't get out of their caves to kill us. We'd put a round on a cave entrance every 30 seconds, all day, all night. It didn't matter if we hit anything. What mattered was that any Jap who tried to come out knew there was a round coming, and he didn't know exactly when. This harassment fire created psychological pressure that accumulated over days. A Japanese soldier could endure a few hours of continuous bombardment, believing it would eventually stop. But when the fire continued for a day, then 2 days, then 3, when the pattern remained random enough that predicting safe moments became impossible, the psychological toll mounted. Captured diaries from Iwo Jima revealed defenders describing a kind of learned helplessness, understanding that leaving the cave meant death, but staying in the cave meant slow starvation and eventual death anyway. The coordination required for this technique was extraordinary. Fire direction centers maintained charts tracking which positions were under harassment, which crews were firing, and when ammunition resupply would be needed. Mortar sections operated in rotation, one section firing for 2 hours while another prepared, then switching. This allowed continuous harassment of multiple targets while preventing barrel overheating and crew exhaustion. The system worked, but it consumed ammunition at rates that strained even the massive American logistics system. By the end of the first week of fighting, Marines had established the pattern that would characterize the rest of the battle. Infantry would identify a Japanese position, call for mortar fire, then advance under a protective barrage. The mortars couldn't destroy the position, but they could suppress it long enough for infantry to close with explosives and flamethrowers. Then the mortars would shift to the next target while the infantry reduced the position they'd just reached. Slow, methodical, brutally expensive in ammunition and lives, but steadily effective. The Japanese responded with their own mortar tactics. Imperial Army mortar crews were well trained and disciplined. The Type 99 81mm mortar was comparable to the American M1, and Japanese gunners used it with considerable skill. But they faced insurmountable disadvantages. American air superiority meant Japanese ammunition resupply was nearly impossible. Positions that revealed themselves by firing were immediately subjected to massive counter-battery fire from American mortars, artillery, and naval gunfire. Japanese mortar crews took to firing just a few rounds, then immediately displacing, but this reduced their effectiveness and prevented the sustained fire that might have disrupted American advances. The psychological dimension of mortar warfare manifested in unexpected ways. American corpsmen reported treating Marines for what appeared to be combat fatigue, but was actually acute stress from being under constant Japanese mortar fire. The random nature of incoming rounds. You might go hours without an attack, then suddenly shells would rain down without warning, created a state of constant vigilance that was mentally exhausting. Japanese defenders, subjected to American mortar fire that was both more intense and more sustained, showed even more severe psychological effects when captured. On February 23rd, when Marines raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi, mortar sections had fired more than 120,000 rounds in support of the assault. The iconic photograph by Joe Rosenthal captured the moment, but mortar crews knew that taking Suribachi had required every round of that expenditure. The mountain's caves and bunkers had been subjected to days of continuous harassment fire that prevented defenders from effectively resisting the final assault. When Marines reached the summit, they found evidence of the toll this fire had taken. Abandoned positions, bodies showing signs of concussion injuries rather than shrapnel wounds, and in several caves, Japanese soldiers who had simply remained in place despite opportunities to fight or flee, paralyzed by days of continuous bombardment. The fighting for the northern portion of Iwo Jima lasted another month and demonstrated the evolution of mortar tactics to their most sophisticated form. The terrain, broken rocks, ridges, and gorges prevented tank support and limited artillery effectiveness. Mortars became the primary fire support weapon. Marines developed what they called box and walk tactics. Mortar fire would create a box pattern around a Japanese position, preventing escape or reinforcement, then slowly compress the box while infantry moved in behind the fire. The technique required exceptional coordination and fire discipline, but when executed properly, it allowed reduction of even heavily fortified positions with acceptable casualties. Technical adaptations accompanied tactical evolution. Mortar crews discovered that by adjusting propellant charges, small explosive increments that could be added or removed from the base of each round, they could fine-tune range with precision impossible at Peleliu. This allowed placement of rounds within a few yards of advancing Marines, providing genuine close support. The danger was real. Several instances occurred where short rounds caused American casualties, but the benefits of accurate close fire outweighed the risks. The ammunition expenditure at Iwo Jima reached staggering proportions. In 36 days of combat, Marine mortar sections fired more than 625,000 rounds of 60 millimeter and 81 millimeter ammunition. To put this in perspective, this represented more mortar ammunition than the entire Marine Corps had fired in the first 2 years of the Pacific War combined. The logistics required to deliver this volume of fire, from ammunition production in the United States to distribution on the island, represented a triumph of American industrial capacity. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese defenders who survived to be captured provided the most detailed insights into the psychological effects of sustained mortar fire. Intelligence officers conducting interrogations on Iwo Jima and later in rear areas compiled reports that revealed patterns of psychological breakdown. One sergeant from the 145th Infantry Regiment described his experience. "We had prepared for an American attack. We knew they had many weapons, but we did not understand what it meant to have shells falling every minute, every hour, every day. You cannot sleep. You cannot eat without fear. You cannot perform bodily functions without the terror that you will die in that moment. After 3 days, some men wished to die just to make it stop." The reports noted that Japanese soldiers described specific triggers for psychological breakdown. The randomness of harassment fire, never knowing when the next round would arrive, created more stress than sustained barrages where the pattern was predictable. The high-angle trajectory of mortar fire meant soldiers couldn't identify safe positions based on terrain. The distinctive whistle of incoming rounds became a sound that would haunt survivors decades later. Multiple former Japanese soldiers reported that even years after the war, hearing similar whistling sounds would trigger immediate panic responses. By March 26th, when Iwo Jima was declared secure, the battle had demonstrated both the power and limitations of coordinated mortar fire. The technique could suppress, demoralize, and ultimately help reduce even the most formidable defenses. But it couldn't win battles alone. It required integration with infantry assault, engineer support, and the willingness of individual Marines to close with and destroy enemy positions. The mortar provided the hammer, but Marines were the anvil. The final major test of these evolved tactics came at Okinawa, where the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War commenced on April 1, 1945. The Japanese garrison of more than 77,000 troops under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima had learned from Iwo Jima. Their defensive plan emphasized deep positions in the southern portion of the island, where limestone caves provided natural protection superior to anything on Iwo. Ushijima knew American mortars would come, knew they would fire in devastating volume, and planned accordingly. The Marines and Army divisions landing on Okinawa brought mortar sections that represented the culmination of 3 years of Pacific War experience. Crews were veterans who had perfected their craft at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and a dozen other islands. Equipment had been refined, improved sights, better propellant increments, more effective ammunition. But most importantly, the doctrine for employment had been codified. Fire direction centers had standardized procedures for coordinating fires. Forward observers understood how to integrate mortars with maneuver. Infantry commanders knew how to exploit the fire support their organic mortars provided. The initial landings were eerily quiet. Ushijima had forbidden beach defenses, ordering his troops to wait in the prepared positions in the south. Marines walked ashore virtually unopposed on April 1st, leading some to believe the Japanese had abandoned the island. The truth became apparent in mid-April, when American forces reached the Shuri defensive line, a network of fortified positions, caves, and bunkers that stretched across the island's southern neck. Here, the battle would stall for weeks, and fighting that exceeded even Iwo Jima's intensity. The rain that began in mid-May added a dimension to the battle that tested every aspect of mortar employment. The ground turned to mud that made movement nearly impossible. Mortar base plates sank in the muck despite improvised platforms. Propellant charges exposed to constant moisture became unreliable. Several incidents occurred where damp charges failed to ignite, requiring crews to manually extract unexploded rounds from tubes, a terrifying process that could result in detonation if the round shifted wrong. Yet the mortars kept firing. Crews rigged shelters from ponchos and salvaged materials to keep ammunition dry. They learned to test each charge before loading, feeling for dampness that indicated unreliability. They adapted firing positions to compensate for unstable ground, and they maintained the continuous fire that had become their signature tactic. In the fighting for Sugarloaf Hill in May, a single mortar platoon from the 6th Marine Division fired more than 12,000 rounds over 6 days, an average of 83 rounds per tube per hour, sustained around the clock. The Japanese defenders at Okinawa experienced the full evolution of American mortar tactics. Coordinated fires from 60 millimeter, 81 millimeter, and 4.2-inch mortars created overlapping zones of fire that made movement suicidal. Harassment fires prevented resupply and reinforcement. Box barrages isolated positions for reduction, and walking barrages preceded every assault, providing the shield behind which infantry advanced. A captured Japanese major, interrogated after the fall of the Shuri line, provided perhaps the most succinct assessment. We could defeat American infantry, we could endure American artillery, but we could not survive the mortars. They were everywhere, always firing, always killing. They gave us no rest, no hope, no chance. The physical evidence supported these psychological assessments. When American troops finally overran Japanese positions in the Shuri line, they found caves littered with dead who showed no visible wounds, killed by overpressure from repeated near-miss explosions. They found positions abandoned not because of damage, but because defenders had fled into deeper caves, unable to withstand another hour of bombardment. They found weapons and ammunition in quantity, suggesting that Japanese forces had possessed the means to fight, but not the psychological capacity to continue. Medical officers studying battle fatigue in American forces found that mortar crews were among the most susceptible to combat exhaustion. The repetitive, dangerous work of firing thousands of rounds while under counter-battery fire created stress that accumulated until men simply stopped functioning. Some crews had to be rotated out of combat not because of casualties, but because of complete psychological exhaustion. The irony wasn't lost on observers. The weapon that broke.
Japanese morale was also breaking the morale of the men who fired it. By June 21st, when organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa ended, American mortar sections had fired more than 1.1 million rounds in 82 days of combat. This expenditure represented an average of more than 13,000 rounds per day, every day, for nearly 3 months. The logistics to support this rate of fire required a dedicated supply system, ammunition ships, shore parties, supply dumps, and thousands of men whose sole job was keeping mortar ammunition flowing to the firing positions. The psychological studies conducted on both Japanese prisoners and American veterans in the war's aftermath revealed the profound effects of sustained mortar bombardment. Japanese survivors reported higher rates of post-war psychological problems than survivors of other types of combat. The continuous nature of mortar fire, its randomness, its inescapability, created trauma that persisted long after the physical danger had passed. American researchers comparing the psychological effects of different weapons systems found that sustained mortar bombardment ranked among the most psychologically damaging experiences of combat.
exceeded only by flamethrower attacks and the terror it induced. The technique that Marine mortar sections had developed through trial and error in the Pacific would influence infantry tactics for generations. The principle of continuous, coordinated, indirect fire became doctrine. The understanding that psychological effects could be as important as physical destruction reshaped thinking about fire support. The integration of organic mortars with infantry maneuver became standard practice in every modern military. What had begun as an improvisation at Peleliu became foundational to modern warfare. Yet the human cost of this innovation remained. The Marines who served in mortar sections suffered casualty rates comparable to rifle platoons. The physical demands of the work, carrying heavy ammunition, operating in dangerous forward positions, enduring constant counter-battery fire, took a toll measured in lives and bodies. Sergeant Elmo Haney, who had commanded a mortar section at Peleliu, survived the war but lost most of his hearing from continuous exposure to muzzle blast. Corporal Albert Mikkel suffered from what would later be recognized as PTSD, triggered by sounds reminiscent of incoming mortar fire. Hundreds of others carried physical and psychological scars from their service operating these weapons. The Japanese soldiers who survived sustained mortar bombardment carried their own scars. In post-war interviews conducted by historians, former defenders described the mortars as more terrifying than any other weapon they'd faced. Not because they were more deadly in absolute terms. Artillery and naval gunfire killed more Japanese soldiers overall, but because of the psychological dimension. The mortars were personal in a way larger. Weapons weren't. They were fired by men close enough that you might have seen them. They came without warning. They could find you anywhere, and most terrifying of all, they never stopped. By August of 1945, when the atomic bombings ended the war before the planned invasion of Japan, American forces had stockpiled millions of mortar rounds in preparation for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the home islands. The plans called for mortar fire support on a scale that would have exceeded even Okinawa. Fire direction officers had calculated that securing a beachhead on Kyushu would require sustained mortar fire at rates exceeding 20,000 rounds per day per division. The logistical plans to support this included dedicated ammunition ships, expanded production facilities, and training programs to create thousands of new mortar crews. Those plans were never executed, but they revealed how completely the mortar barrage technique had become integrated into American doctrine. What had been an innovation in 1944 had become standard operating procedure by 1945. The weapon itself, the M260 mm mortar, remained essentially unchanged from its introduction. But the tactics for its employment had evolved from simple fire missions to sophisticated, coordinated barrages that could suppress, demoralize, and ultimately help defeat even fanatically determined defenders. The legacy of these tactics extended far beyond World War II. In Korea, Vietnam, and every subsequent American conflict, mortars remained a primary infantry fire support weapon. The techniques developed in the Pacific, continuous fire, harassment missions, coordinated barrages, became standard tactics taught to every infantry officer. The understanding that psychological effects could equal or exceed physical destruction shaped thinking about fire support across all weapon systems. The integration of organic mortars with infantry maneuver remained a cornerstone of American military doctrine into the 21st century. For the Japanese soldiers who had endured these barrages, the memory remained vivid decades later. In oral histories collected in the 1970s and 80s, elderly Japanese veterans would describe the American mortars in voices that still carried echoes of the fear they'd experienced. They spoke of the sound, that distinctive whistle that announced incoming death. They described the psychological toll, the inability to rest, to eat, to perform normal human functions without terror. They recalled comrades who had broken under the strain, who had fled their positions not from cowardice but from psychological collapse. The mathematics of the technique remained brutal in their simplicity. 8 mortars, firing in coordinated sequence, 160 rounds per minute, a new explosion every 3.75 seconds. Sustained not for minutes, but for hours, sometimes for days. For the Japanese, soldiers in their caves and bunkers, this created an experience that transcended normal combat. It became an endurance test where survival depended not on skill or courage, but on psychological resilience against pressure that accumulated without relief. The irony was that the weapon itself was relatively simple. The M2 mortar had no complex fire control system, no advanced optics, and no sophisticated mechanisms. It was a steel tube with a firing pin, mounted on a base plate with a bipod for support. Any infantryman could learn to operate it in an afternoon. But the technique that Marine mortar sections developed, the coordination, the timing, the integration with maneuver, transformed this simple weapon into something that Japanese defenders came to fear more than any other weapon in the American arsenal. In the final accounting, mortar sections in the Pacific Theater fired more than 3 million rounds during the war. This expenditure represented approximately 150,000 tons of ammunition delivered onto Japanese positions. The industrial effort to produce, ship, and deliver this volume of fire was a testament to American logistics. The tactical innovation to employ this fire effectively was a testament to Marine ingenuity, and the psychological effect it had on those subjected to it was a testament to the human mind's vulnerability to sustained, inescapable stress. The captured documents, interrogation reports, and post-war testimonies painted a consistent picture. Japanese soldiers who had faced American mortars described an experience that broke men in ways that other weapons did not. The continuous nature of the fire, the randomness that prevented adaptation, the inescapability that created hopelessness. Together, these factors created psychological pressure that accumulated until even the most disciplined, most fanatical defenders reached their breaking point. Private First Class Robert Leckie, who had landed at Peleliu as part of a mortar section in September of 1944, survived the war and later wrote about his experiences. In his memoir, he described the psychological toll on both sides. "We fired thousands of rounds. Every day, all day, sometimes all night. We knew what it was doing to the Japanese because we could see it in the prisoners, in the abandoned positions, in the bodies we found in caves. But we felt it too. Every round we fired was a few ounces of our own souls going downrange. By the end, I think we were as broken as they were. We'd just broken them first." The technique that had emerged from the desperate fighting at Peleliu, been refined at Iwo Jima, and perfected at Okinawa, represented more than just tactical innovation. It represented a fundamental shift in how infantry warfare was conducted. The integration of organic indirect fire support with maneuver, the understanding that psychological effects mattered as much as physical destruction, the willingness to expend ammunition in volume that would have seemed wasteful in earlier wars. All of these became standard features of modern combat. For the Marines who had developed and employed these tactics, the memory carried mixed emotions. Pride in their effectiveness and innovation, sorrow for comrades lost while serving the weapons, and perhaps a deeper unease about what they had unleashed. The ability to subject human beings to continuous bombardment that broke their will to resist was undeniably effective. But it was also terrible in the original sense of that word, inspiring terror and awe in equal measure. The Japanese defenders who survived carried memories that shaped the rest of their lives. In the decades after the war, Japanese veterans associations would hold annual gatherings where survivors shared their experiences. Among the most common topics were the American mortars, the sounds, the fear, the psychological pressure that never relented. For these men, the war had ended in 1945, but the sound of those incoming rounds remained, echoing in nightmares that persisted for decades. The story of Marine mortar tactics in the Pacific represents one of countless innovations born from the crucible of combat. What began as a simple observation, that coordinated continuous fire was more effective than individual fire missions, evolved through practical experience into a sophisticated technique that helped win a war. The human cost of both developing and enduring this technique was substantial. The legacy it left shaped infantry warfare for generations to come. In the end, the titles claim that Japanese soldiers were terrified when U.S. Marines fired 8 mortars simultaneously every 3 seconds understates the reality. They weren't just terrified at that moment. They were subjected to an experience that broke the psychological defenses humans developed to cope with combat. The continuous fire, the lack of respite, the accumulating psychological pressure. These created conditions where even the most determined defenders reached a point where continued resistance became impossible, not because of casualties, but because of psychological collapse. The 8 mortars, firing in sequence every 3 seconds, created more than just physical destruction. They created a psychological weapon that proved as effective as any technology developed during the war. And for the Japanese soldiers who endured it, for the Marines who fired it, the experience left marks that lasted far longer than the war itself. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.